John Watson's life wasn't always marked by tension and disillusionment. There was a time when everything seemed full of promise. Growing up in a tough neighborhood, he had to make hard choices to survive. His mother married Tim Murphy, a strict cop who kept John from falling into a life of crime. Though John initially resented Tim, he later realized that Tim's influence steered him toward academic success. He transformed from a rebellious teen into a serious student, eventually discovering a passion for history. John's academic achievements led to a promising career, and he soon met Esther Prynne, a lively law student. They quickly fell in love, moving in together and planning a future. John was sure they were destined for a happy marriage, but the pressures of their careers began to strain their relationship, leading to an unexpected rift. On a gloomy autumn day, the overcast sky matched John Watson's mood. He unfolded his tall frame from the car and headed to the saloon, seeking refuge from the week's stress. A colleague's sudden resignation had left him scrambling for a replacement, with 3 failed interviews only adding to his frustration. Students were also upset over delayed textbooks, but what weighed most heavily on him was the growing tension in his marriage. "Hi, Professor. Haven't seen you in a while." Chester, the bartender, greeted him quietly. "Hi, Chester. I'll have a scotch and water," John replied, noting it was just after 4 p.m. As he waited, John's eyes wandered around the familiar old saloon, a place that had been his retreat since graduate school. His mind drifted back to when he was finishing his doctorate in American history. His manuscript on Henry Clay was set to be published, and he had just been offered a teaching position. Though the pay was modest, he couldn't have been happier. Esther had graduated law school and secured a job with a prestigious firm, and they had been living together for a year. John had saved up to buy an engagement ring, and Esther's joy when he proposed had filled him with pride. They were set to marry in the spring. John's thoughts turned to a younger, vibrant Esther. Her zest for life made her seem taller than her 5'4" frame, with her long blonde hair and sparkling blue eyes. He recalled how deeply they had loved each other. But the somber mood returned as he remembered the New Year's Eve party at Esther's law firm, shortly after their engagement. He never felt at ease with her colleagues, sensing their contempt for his career choice, which only fueled tensions between him and Esther. By 11 that night, the party had descended into chaos, with drunken antics that made John uncomfortable. He had always been careful not to drink too much, determined not to follow in his father's footsteps, a man who had died in a drunken crash, leaving John's mother to fend for them in poverty. Reflecting on his past, John recalled the mean streets of his youth, where he had roamed with a gang until Tim Murphy came into his life. As a cop, Tim put an end to John's wild ways, showing him that the path he was on led only to misery. John wasn't foolish, and his transition from gang member to honor student happened quickly. Within a few months, he buckled down and started enjoying school for the first time. During this time, he also vowed never to let booze control his life, determined not to become like his father. This resolve was why he felt so uncomfortable at that party, where almost no one, including Esther, was sober. Esther, usually a light drinker, teased him for being a buzzkill and urged him to relax. She was clearly tipsy, and John tried to convince her to leave. She snapped at him, insisting it wasn't even midnight yet and she wanted to stay. John reluctantly waited, avoiding the drunken crowd. As midnight approached, he searched for Esther and finally found her in a passionate embrace with James Moriarty, another young lawyer. Their kiss was far from innocent, and John, pale and trembling, stormed over and pulled her away. "What the hell do you think you're doing? Did you forget you're engaged?" he hissed. Moriarty made the mistake of shoving John, who quickly knocked him to the floor. Esther, furious and red-faced, slapped John hard, drawing the room's attention. In the stunned silence, John calmly removed the engagement ring from her finger, dropped it, and ground it under his heel. Without another word, he walked out, shaking with anger and humiliation. As he reached his car, he forced himself to calm down, though his thoughts were far from rational. All he wanted was to get back to their apartment, pack his things, and leave as quickly as possible. Esther had crossed a line, and John didn't care that she was drunk. His anger left no room for forgiveness. Back at the apartment, John quickly packed his belongings, filling 2 suitcases and a duffel bag. Looking around, he felt a wave of sadness at how little he had to show for their time together. He knew this wasn't just a minor argument. It struck at the core of their relationship, which he now believed was likely over. He doubted he could trust Esther again, either with his fidelity or his dignity. If she wanted to play around, she could do it without him. John soon checked into a Holiday Inn near campus, and began planning his next steps. He knew there were rooms available for unmarried faculty at the university, and he intended to lease one. The next day, he realized he had a lot to think about regarding Esther, but he suspected they were done. He also knew he was too angry and embarrassed to think clearly, so distancing himself for a while seemed necessary. In the days that followed, John buried himself in work, ignoring Esther's calls and tearing up her messages. He wasn't ready to face her or risk another confrontation. Despite his anger, he missed her terribly and wondered if he was overreacting to what might have been just a drunken mistake, though deep down he doubted that explanation. 2 weeks after the party, John reluctantly agreed to have lunch with Art Doyle at the Fairmont Country Club. Doyle had called and insisted on meeting, and John suspected the reason, but kept an open mind. Entering the sunlit dining room, John spotted Doyle seated by the windows and approached the table. Doyle greeted him warmly, extending his hand. "Hello, John. Thanks for coming," Art said with a smile. "Thanks, Mr. Doyle. Nice to see you again," John replied, though his enthusiasm was muted. Doyle smiled gently. "John, please call me Art. I've asked you before. I hope you can consider me a friend." "Of course, Art. I have a lot of respect for you and appreciate the kindness you've shown me," John said as they sat down. They made small talk over lunch until the table was cleared and coffee was served. Doyle looked at John with genuine affection. "John, I'm sure you know why I invited you to lunch. Besides enjoying your company, the main reason is—" "Esther, please just hear me out for a few moments, okay?" John sighed and nodded, knowing this conversation was inevitable, and even welcoming it. He hoped Art could help mend the rift between him and Esther. Art smiled as he began. "John, first, I want to apologize on behalf of the firm. The party got out of hand, and it shouldn't have. Everyone was reprimanded afterward. As for Moriarty, he's been transferred to another city. It turns out his plan to seduce Esther wasn't a secret, and he's gone now. Firing him would have been messier." John raised an eyebrow. "Plan of seduction? So this wasn't just a one-time thing?" he wondered, thinking about what else Esther might have kept from him. Art, sensing John's thoughts, quickly reassured him. "John, I looked into it, and nothing happened beyond what you saw on New Year's Eve. Esther is a mess right now, and I don't want this to ruin a good relationship. It's clear you both still love each other. It's time to talk and sort this out." John knew Art was right. "I think I'm ready to have a rational conversation with Esther. I'll call her and set something up." Art grinned. "No need, John. Esther's expecting you at the apartment for dinner tonight. Don't worry, I knew you'd come around." John smiled wryly. "Fine, Art. I'll be there, but not for dinner. I'll come around 8, and we can talk over coffee. And thanks, Art. I needed the push." That evening, John and Esther talked for nearly 2 hours. Esther, nervous and agitated, struggled to start. John waited patiently, knowing that if they were to move forward, they needed to be honest with each other. He wasn't going to make it easy. Esther had caused this crisis, and it was up to her to begin fixing it. Finally, Esther looked up, tears in her eyes. "John, I owe you an apology. I don't know why I kissed him like that. I guess it was the drinks. I'm ashamed and hope you can forgive me." John sighed, looking at her calmly. "I understand, but that doesn't lessen the hurt. You sided with someone else instead of me, and that was humiliating. If this is what I have to expect, I'm not sure we should continue." Esther, pale, shook her head. "No, John, please, I love you. Don't let one stupid mistake ruin what we have." "Esther," John replied softly, "we need to be clear about what we expect from each other if we're going to be married. We have to agree on what honor, love, and fidelity mean." In the end, Esther apologized again and promised never to drink to excess. John also apologized for his temper, though he didn't feel his reaction was out of line. They discussed their expectations around fidelity, loyalty, and trust. The next day, John moved back into the apartment, and over time, things returned to normal. Interestingly, John never bought another engagement ring, and Esther never asked for one. They married in the spring, as planned, and had a good marriage. Their love was tested when they discovered John was sterile, but they decided to accept it and focused on their relationship and work. John blinked, realizing he'd been daydreaming. Relieved to see not much time had passed, he noticed his drink was empty and motioned to Chester for another. As he sipped his drink, he thought of Art Doyle with deep affection, feeling a lingering sadness at his recent passing. John had really only formed close friendships with 2 people at the law firm, Art Doyle and Lee Lestrade, a younger partner. Lee joined the firm about 10 years ago and quickly connected with John, starting at one of the company's gatherings. Lee was impressed by John's position as a professor as Lee himself had always harbored a secret desire to teach. John was glad Lee was still around, but thoughts of his wife Esther darkened his mood. Their 20th anniversary was approaching, but the strain in their relationship made it hard for him to look forward to the milestone. Over nearly 2 decades, their marriage had deteriorated slowly and subtly, and John only recently realized how bad things had gotten. The lack of affection, growing indifference, and even disrespect had become all too apparent, with small spats and a lack of physical closeness now the norm. John was unsure how to address the issues with Esther. He dreaded the thought of another argument, as Esther's sharp tongue had become more frequent. Has it really gotten so bad that I can't even talk to her? He wondered. John was startled by a voice at his ear. Hey, buddy, buy a girl a drink. It was Irene, prompting a small smile from him. Renee! He exclaimed. What are you doing here? You're the last person I expected to see. I stop by every few weeks, John, for old time's sake. Order me a gin and tonic. I'll be right back, she said, heading to the restroom. John smiled affectionately after her. Dr. Irene Adler, an attractive woman in her late 30s, was more than just good-looking. Tall and confident, with dark hair and striking eyes, she was now the assistant chair of the Drama and Performing Arts Department. John and Esther had supported her through 2 divorces and numerous failed relationships, and John considered her his closest friend. When Irene returned, she sat next to John and said, Okay, Johnny, what's the problem? Why do you think there's a problem? And don't give me that nonsense about stopping by here regularly, John replied without much bite. Irene laughed. I saw your car outside as I was driving by and decided to check if it was really you in here. John gazed at her with genuine affection. He trusted her completely, which made it easy for him to open up. He poured out his frustration and confusion about his marriage, and Irene listened, feeling sorrow for her friend's pain. She hadn't realized how much he was hurting and was shocked to discover the rift between him and Esther. John, something must have caused this, Irene interrupted. What you're describing sounds like a buildup of small issues, but there's got to be a deeper reason. Have either of you done something that really upset the other? I can't believe you both just drifted into this state. There has to be a cause. John shook his head. I don't know, Renee. I can't pinpoint anything specific. It feels like we just drifted into this mess and I don't know how to fix it. How about talking to her, John? Just sit down and talk, Irene suggested gently. We've tried, but it always turns into a fight. She accuses me of being paranoid and I lose patience. It's just not working, John replied, his voice fading. Meanwhile, across town, Esther Watson leaned back in her office chair, staring at the tall blonde man across from her. She didn't hide her appraisal of Jim Moriarty, who had been trying to seduce her for months. Though she found him attractive, she knew he wasn't worth risking her marriage over, even if her marriage seemed to be crumbling. Jim, she said, you've been back for over 6 months and you haven't changed. You're still a relentless womanizer. Why not get married again and stop hunting? Come on, Essie, Jim chuckled. I'm just being friendly. You're a beautiful woman, and any man would want to be with you. Your husband is an idiot, more interested in his books than in you, and you know I'm right. You want me? I can see it in your eyes. And it will happen, Esther. It will happen. Esther bit her lip and looked away. Moriarty's comments struck closer to home than she wanted to admit. She was fully aware of the growing distance between her and John. Their relationship had cooled, and John's occasional jabs about lawyers didn't help. She often found herself snapping back, criticizing his profession in return. What used to be harmless teasing had now turned into something more hurtful. Maybe I should have told John about Jim being transferred back, she thought, but I was afraid of his reaction. I hope not telling him wasn't a mistake. Turning her attention back to Moriarty, she said, Jim, let's not go there. My home life is off limits. Leave it alone. Moriarty just smiled. Okay, but remember, I'm always here for you. You've got a friend in me. Yeah, a real friend, Esther replied with a grimace. I know what you're after, Jim. Go chase someone else, but keep it out of the office. Now let's get back to work on the Simmons contract. Moriarty laughed, leaned over and brushed her lips with his before she could react. Then he walked out, humming. Esther sat for a moment, breathing heavily, ashamed to admit that his gesture had affected her. She touched her lips, feeling a thrill she hadn't felt in a long time with John. Is this where all this flirting is leading? She wondered, but she quickly shook off the thought. Her phone rang and she answered it with impatience. It was Stan Hopkins. Yes? Are you finishing the Simmons contract? He asked. Yes, Stan. We've been at it for months. Why? Is there a problem? Not really, but you'll need to fly up to see him on Monday. He can't make it here, and he wants it finalized then. Damn it, Stan, Esther protested. It's Friday, and we'll have to work all weekend to meet that deadline. I've only had Jim helping me on this. Stan sighed. I know, Essie. I'll get you more help tomorrow, but you'll likely have to work late. Get some rest tonight, and we'll start early tomorrow. Esther ended the call with a half-hearted, okay. She knew this would likely cause another argument with John, who had been complaining about her workload. She feared this might be the final straw, but promised herself that once this project was done, they would focus on their marriage, maybe even take a vacation. She recognized that she had been short and impatient with John lately, and vowed to change once the project was over. Meanwhile, in his office, James Moriarty leaned back, smiling grimly. He knew Esther was vulnerable, and was confident that he could eventually win her over. He hadn't forgotten the New Year's Eve confrontation with John, which had led to his transfer and stalled career. Now he was back, and his plan for revenge was to make Esther his. The weather had turned cooler, and John was eager to get home. He was disappointed to find the house dark as he pulled into the driveway. Crap, he muttered, assuming Esther was working late again. But just then, Esther's car pulled up beside his. Surprised, he waited by the door. Hi, sweetie, she said cheerfully. We made it home at the same time. How about we freshen up and go out for a nice dinner? John was wary. Esther's sudden cheerfulness seemed out of place. Something's up, he thought, but decided to play along to see what she had in mind. Despite his doubts, they had a lovely dinner and a warm conversation, which gave John hope. Perhaps they could rekindle what they had lost over the years. For the first time in a long while, John really looked at Esther, appreciating her beauty and sensuality, even after 40 years. He realized he might have been neglecting her, too focused on his career, and resolved to make more of an effort to strengthen their marriage. Esther, too, felt encouraged as she noticed John opening up. She saw the desire in his eyes and felt a surge of affection for him. She vowed to work on their relationship, hoping to get through the Simmons project soon so she could focus on her marriage. As they drove home, Esther cuddled into John's arm, and soon they were home, sharing a glass of wine by the fire with soft music playing in the background. Esther knew she needed to tell John about working tomorrow and the out-of-town trip on Monday. She bit her lip, dreading the conversation, and debated whether to wait until the last minute. But she realized that would only make him angrier, so she decided to face it now, even though she knew it wouldn't be easy. Honey, I have good news, she began. The Simmons project is almost done, and we can get back to normal soon. I have to work tomorrow to finish the final draft, and then we'll fly out Monday to wrap things up. I don't need to hear any more, John interrupted sharply. It's clear your career is more important to you than our marriage. I've heard it all before. He turned to leave, but before heading upstairs, he paused. Think about what you really want, Essie. I'll do the same. He then went to the guest room, where he undressed and lay in bed, unable to sleep, staring at the ceiling most of the night. The next morning, Esther was up early. She quickly dressed and left without breakfast, still angry about John's harsh words. She knew their marriage was on shaky ground, but pushed those thoughts aside to focus on work. John woke up late, feeling exhausted. He went through his morning routine and noticed that Esther hadn't even made coffee before leaving. He sat at the kitchen table, head in his hands, regretting how he had snapped at her. He knew he had been short-tempered for months, but couldn't pinpoint why. Their once loving relationship had turned into constant conflict, and he was determined to fight for their marriage. Remembering their pleasant dinner the night before, John smiled slightly, realizing he still loved Esther. He regretted his outburst and decided to surprise her at work, hoping to take her out for lunch. He knew he needed to be more supportive and planned to show her that he was committed to improving their marriage. As he drove to Esther's office, he felt optimistic, but then his car got a flat tire. Frustrated, he pulled into a nearby diner parking lot and called for roadside assistance, which would take 30 minutes to an hour. Deciding to eat while he waited, he entered the diner and spotted Lee Lestrade, a senior partner at Esther's firm, sitting alone. "John, what a surprise! Join me," Lee said, waving him over. John smiled and sat down. "Nice to see you, Lee. What brings you here on a Saturday?" "Emily's out of town visiting a friend, so I'm on my own. I stopped by the office for a file and decided to grab a bite here. What about you?" "I was on my way to see if Esther wanted lunch, but I got a flat tire. So much for my plans," John chuckled. "Buck up, John. The project Esther and Jim are working on will be done in a few days. We can all celebrate when they're back." "Jim?" John asked, surprised. I don't recall Esther mentioning him. Jim Moriarty. He was transferred to the main office about 6 months ago. I'm surprised Esther didn't mention him. They've been working together on this project for a while, Lee explained, not noticing the color drain from John's face. John felt his throat tighten and his stomach churn. A red haze clouded his vision, but he managed to keep control. I guess I haven't been paying attention, Lee. Sometimes it feels like Esther and I live in two different worlds. He forced a smile, though it didn't reach his eyes. Yeah, we're all guilty of that sometimes, Lee laughed. It took every bit of John's self-control to stay in that booth, eat his sandwich, and continue talking with Lee. His mind was racing, but he forced himself to stay calm. His heart pounded, and sweat trickled down his sides. When the auto service truck finally arrived, he quickly excused himself. John drove home on autopilot, realizing when he arrived that he couldn't remember the trip. He took a deep breath, stumbled into the house, and sat down, feeling empty and lost. His thoughts were chaotic and he couldn't focus. His mind screamed, "Esther is having an affair!" He fought against the idea, but it kept coming back, leaving him trembling and in pain. He poured himself a drink but then poured it out, refusing to follow in his father's footsteps. John went to the bathroom, considered taking some of Esther's Xanax, but decided against it. He smiled bitterly at the thought. Gradually, the shock wore off and his mind began to clear, though still erratically. So Jim Moriarty is back, he thought. And she didn't tell me. No wonder our marriage has been falling apart. He knew he couldn't stay married to a cheater. The word divorce loomed large in his mind, and he realized that counseling was no longer an option. It was too late. As the initial sorrow faded, John felt an icy calm replace it. The boy who had survived the streets took control. He would not be a sufferer. But before taking action, he needed proof. He needed to be sure of Esther's infidelity before he could confront her. A grim smile crossed his lips. "There's a price for cheating," he muttered as he picked up the phone, unaware of the tears streaming down his face. Meanwhile, at the office, Stan Hopkins called out to Esther, "I'm heading out. Are you guys almost done?" "A couple more hours, Stan," she replied. "Jim is finishing up the first draft, and I'm nearly done here." "Don't forget your flight tomorrow evening. Get some rest before your meeting with Simmons," Stan said as he left. Esther sighed, knowing this would likely cause another argument with John. She wondered if they could ever get back to the love they once had. Spending a couple of nights away with Jim, even in separate rooms, could be disastrous if John found out. She worried that not telling him about Jim's return was a serious mistake. "I've done nothing wrong and intend to keep it that way," she thought, but anxiety lingered. Later, Irene greeted John at her door. "Come in, John. You didn't sound like yourself on the phone. Do you want a drink?" "Nothing, Irene," John replied. "Thanks for letting me come over. I really need to talk." Noticing his drawn features and red eyes, Irene knew something was very wrong. She led him to the living room where he sat down, trying to smile. "I'm sorry for bringing my problems to you, Renee. You're always there to share them," he said, attempting a chuckle. Irene waited, inviting his confidence. John began to share his suspicion that Esther was having an affair. "It all makes sense now, Renee. Why our marriage has deteriorated. Her coldness, the lack of affection, the disrespect." His voice rose before he regained control. "I don't even remember the last time we really made love or even kissed. Can you believe that?" Tears welled in his eyes as he spoke. Irene felt deep sympathy for John and Esther. Despite what John had shared, she found it hard to believe Esther would cheat, knowing how much she loved him. "John," Irene said gently, "I know learning about Moriarty's return has shaken you, but think this through. Maybe Essie didn't mention it because she knew you'd react badly. Couldn't that be the reason?" John shook his head. "I've considered that, but it doesn't explain everything. His return coincided with our problems, and that's too much of a coincidence. I never doubted her before, even with the late nights and weekends. But now, it's clear, Esther is having an affair with Moriarty. I can't accept that. Our marriage is over. I just need to get the proof before I file for divorce." Irene gasped. "Divorce? John, aren't you jumping to conclusions? You only have suspicions. Talk to Essie first. You know she can't lie to you." "She's been lying to me for months, Irene. I need proof. Can you help me disguise myself so I can follow them and catch her in the act?" Irene laughed despite the tension. "John, you don't need makeup. Just change your appearance a bit. Wear a baseball cap, some glasses, and casual clothes. That'll be enough." John nodded. "Good idea. I'll fly out after she does and see what I find. At least I'll be doing something." As John left, Irene hugged him and asked to be kept informed. After he left, she stood in the doorway, thinking deeply. her heart heavy for her friend. A stray thought crossed her mind. If John divorces Esther, he'll be available. She quickly dismissed it, scolding herself for even thinking it. But the idea lingered. John returned home late, having walked for miles to clear his mind. Exhausted and emotionally drained, he entered the dark house and collapsed into bed without undressing. Despite his turmoil, he fell into a deep, dreamless sleep. The next day was tense at the Watson household. John and Esther avoided each other, and when the taxi arrived, Esther left without a word. John watched her leave, considering whether his trip the next day was even necessary, but he decided he needed proof, if only for closure. The following morning, a very different-looking John Watson checked into a hotel. Wearing a Phillies cap, horn-rimmed glasses, and casual clothes, he looked nothing like his usual self. Convinced he wouldn't be recognized, he chose a spot in the lobby where he could watch the elevators discreetly. Before heading to his room, John noticed a hotel flower shop. He ordered a dozen roses to be delivered to Esther's room, then positioned himself in the lobby. Soon he saw a bellman carrying the flowers to the elevator. John followed him, noting the room number, 1212, before quickly retreating to avoid being seen. He then returned to his own room on the 9th floor, determined to get the evidence he needed. John took his seat in the lobby around 4 o'clock, pretending to read a newspaper but mostly watching the clock as time crawled by. Finally, at 6:33, he saw Esther enter the lobby with James Moriarty. Despite the years since he'd last seen him, John recognized him instantly. They both looked frustrated, as if their negotiations had gone poorly. Moriarty tried to guide Esther into the dining room, but she pulled away and headed for the elevators, with Moriarty following. After a quick meal in the hotel coffee shop, John returned to his spot in the lobby, pretending to be engrossed in his newspaper. He stayed there until after 11 o'clock, then headed to his room, deep in thought. Maybe I'm being paranoid, he wondered. Their interactions seemed purely professional, no affection, no signs of an affair. But doubts lingered as he prepared for bed. He knew he needed to discuss his concerns with Esther calmly and rationally, without letting it turn into another argument. If they couldn't resolve their issues, they might have to face the end of their marriage. The next morning, John woke late, feeling exhausted despite the sleep. After a quick shower and a light breakfast, he reconsidered his suspicions. Maybe I jumped to conclusions, he thought. He decided to continue his vigil in the lobby for the next 2 nights, though he was starting to doubt anything incriminating would happen. That evening, John was back in his chair in the lobby, anxiously watching the clock. At 7:14, he saw Esther and Moriarty enter the lobby, laughing and holding each other. Moriarty had his arm around Esther's shoulder, and they were clearly enjoying themselves. They headed into the hotel dining room, out of John's sight. Esther was thrilled. They had finally secured Simmons's signature on the contract, and she knew this success could lead to a partnership at the firm. Despite Jim's reputation, she felt grateful for his help. As they celebrated with dinner and wine, Esther's spirits soared, and she agreed to join Jim for a drink in the lounge after changing out of her suit. John watched anxiously as Esther went to the elevators, and Moriarty headed to the lounge. He decided to follow Moriarty and have a drink himself to relieve his tension. Sitting at the far end of the bar, he discreetly watched Moriarty through the bar's mirrored backdrop. He noticed Moriarty sitting alone in a corner booth, nursing a drink. As John sipped his scotch, he began to feel more confident that his fears were unfounded and mentally prepared an apology to Esther. But he kept a close eye on Moriarty, puzzled by his solitary behavior in the nearly empty lounge. John glanced at his watch. It was almost 9:30. He started to leave when his stomach clenched. Esther walked into the lounge, wearing a white silk blouse, a tight black skirt, and a string of pearls John had given her for her 40th birthday. He watched in the mirror as she unsteadily approached Moriarty, who stood to greet her, took her hand, and slid into the booth beside her. From his distance, John couldn't hear their conversation, but the scene spoke volumes. Moriarty ordered drinks, and as they chatted, John saw his wife smiling, laughing, and glowing. Moriarty stroked her hand and touched her arm, and John's anger burned hotter. The sight confirmed what he had dreaded. His marriage was over. But John wasn't going to let this go quietly. He watched grimly as Moriarty whispered in Esther's ear, making her giggle. With the wine from dinner and more drinks, Esther was clearly intoxicated. She didn't resist when Moriarty ordered another round, and she quickly drained her glass. Feeling warm and euphoric, she didn't stop Moriarty when he kissed her. At first, she tried to push him away, but soon she was pulling him closer, their kiss deepening. Suddenly, John's voice cut through the moment. "I'm sure you won't mind if I join you. I should applaud. "But I won't," he said, sliding into the booth opposite them. Esther, confused, gasped when she realized her husband was sitting across from her. Moriarty fumbled to fix his clothes and tried to leave, but John stopped him with a venomous whisper. "You move, and I'll rip your face off." Moriarty, remembering their previous encounter, decided not to challenge John and remained seated, looking frightened. Esther, now sober, was chilled by John's icy demeanor and the contempt in his eyes. "Tell me about my paranoia, Essie," John said coldly. "Tell me how unreasonable I am, how I should be more understanding." Turning to Moriarty, who was squirming, John continued, "I should thank you for pulling your hand out when I arrived. I'm not sure my wife would have thought to do that." Esther, now in tears, felt nauseous and lightheaded. The man before her was unrecognizable, not because of his clothes, but because of the hatred in his eyes. John's voice dripped with sarcasm as he said, "I should apologize for interrupting. I should have let you continue. You were so engrossed. How long have you been screwing him, honey? How did it feel making me a cuckoo?" John's rage was barely contained. Moriarty tried to speak, but John cut him off. "Get out, you creep. But remember, one day I'll find you and I'll eliminate you. It may not be tomorrow or next week, but one day." Moriarty didn't wait for a second warning and nearly ran out of the lounge. John chuckled grimly as he watched him leave, then turned back to Esther, who stared at him in horror. She had never heard such venom in his voice. John looked at her disheveled clothes, bile rising in his throat, and wondered what had gone so wrong between them. Was it him? Was he that bad of a husband? Or was it Esther who was so dissatisfied with him and his profession? John suddenly realized he didn't care about the reasons anymore. His thoughts were interrupted by Esther's tearful voice. "John, please, I let things go too far. I was just so happy about the Simmons contract. Please forgive me. I'm so sorry," she sobbed. John stared at her. "Shut up, Esther. I don't want to hear any more lies or excuses," he muttered wearily. He then revealed her underwear, a twisted piece of red nylon and lace. "I gave these to you for your birthday. You said scarlet was your favorite color. You saved them for a special occasion, but not for me. You wore them today for him." His voice turned bitter. "Stay here with Moriarty. Don't come home until I'm gone. I'm filing for divorce." Esther gasped, turning pale. "We'll split everything, but you can have the house. I'll take my clothes and research materials. Don't fight it, Essie, or I'll testify about tonight and ruin your career. And his." John pocketed her undergarments, stood up, and walked away, leaving Esther sobbing. 3 months later, John had moved out and filed for divorce, but Esther was fighting it. Despite his threat to expose her affair, John found he couldn't bring himself to do it. He realized he didn't want to publicly humiliate her or himself. His attorney, Sherwood Holmes, informed him that Esther wanted a private conversation before she would agree to the divorce. Holmes advised John to talk to her to avoid dragging the process out and costing him more money. John, sitting in Holmes's office, gazed out the window, then snapped, "Screw her. Let her fight the divorce. I don't care." Holmes, leaning back in his chair, tried to reason with him. "John, we've been friends a long time. This will cost you a fortune if you don't settle. Just talk to her so you can move on." But John refused. "No, Woody, I know what she'll say. She'll either admit the affair and beg for forgiveness or lie about it. I don't want to hear it. Hold off on the divorce. It's not important anymore. I'm not planning to remarry." Holmes sighed. "Okay, John, but when you're ready, let's have dinner. It's been too long." John apologized for not reaching out sooner, knowing Holmes was still grieving the loss of his wife. He promised to call soon, then left the office, his shoulders slumped in the cold gray afternoon. John returned to his new townhouse, a rental he'd spent weeks fixing up to start his new life. As he walked through the rooms, he simmered at Esther's refusal to let go. Despite the spacious modern surroundings, what truly pleased him was the small add-on, a hot tub where he had spent many hours relaxing, trying to ease his mental tension. Meanwhile, Irene was going through her own troubles. "Damn it, Irene, it's not the end of the world," Tony yelled. "It's just not working." "Screw you, Tony," Irene shot back. "You're just scared of your mother. Get out." She turned away, hiding her tears. Tony hesitated, looking regretful, then quietly left. Irene collapsed on the sofa, a wry smile on her lips. She didn't truly love Tony, but it frustrated her that she couldn't keep a man. "What's wrong with me?" she wondered. "Why can't I find someone to share my life with?" Irene took a deep breath and headed to the bathroom. After using the toilet, she stepped into the shower, letting the hot water wash away some of her tension. She quickly soaped up, rinsed off, and dried herself with a towel. As she reached for her robe, she caught sight of herself in the full-length mirror and critically examined her reflection, a tall, mature woman with flawless olive skin and short, dark hair framing her face. She grimaced and muttered, "Crap." Irritated, she threw on her robe and flopped onto the bed. She tried to distract herself by reading a novel, but quickly gave up, tossing the book aside. "Damn it, I need a drink," she said aloud. She went to the kitchen, poured herself a bourbon on the rocks, and sank into an easy chair in the living room, wondering where her life was headed. "Stop feeling sorry for yourself," she muttered. "I need company. I need to get out." An idea sparked, and she picked up the phone and dialed. "John, it's Irene. Are you busy? I'd like to come over." After hearing his response, she said, "Great, I'll see you in an hour or sooner." As darkness fell, Irene pulled into John's driveway. Before she could ring the bell, John opened the door and pulled her into the warm foyer. "Perfect timing," John laughed. "The food just arrived. Give me your coat and let's eat." "Wow, John, you sure know how to treat a girl. I didn't realize how hungry I was until now," Irene replied. They chatted while enjoying Chinese takeout, then moved to the living room with the last of a bottle of wine. After some banter, John suggested, "Enough of this light stuff. Let's get serious." He fetched a bottle of good scotch, poured them both a drink, and settled across from her. "Okay, what's bothering you? Tell Uncle John." Irene laughed and sipped her drink. "This is good stuff, John, but yeah, it's Tony. He broke up with me today. What's wrong with me? Why can't I keep a man?" John leaned forward. "Renee, the problem is the guys you choose. You're a beautiful, intelligent woman, but you keep picking idiots who break your heart." Irene was taken aback, initially angry, but soon realized he was right. "Son of a witch, you're right. Why haven't I seen that before?" "You're not a loser, Renee," John reassured her. "Maybe you should talk to someone who can help. Hell, maybe I should too." They exchanged a look, then burst into laughter. "What a pair we are," Irene said, taking another sip. "At least you had almost 20 great years with one woman." Realizing her mistake as she saw John's eyes tear up, she quickly apologized. "Nah, it's okay," John replied. "Those were wonderful years, which makes this all the harder. When trust is gone, everything is suspect." He sighed. "Let's just get drunk together." They continued drinking, knowing it wouldn't help but not caring. After a while, Irene slurred, "Johnny, you never let me use that spa out there." "Let's do it now," John agreed, stumbling toward her. With their arms linked, they made their way to the alcove. "Uh-oh, no swimsuit," Irene said, laughing. "Screw it. Let's skinny dip," John replied, and they both undressed. They soon found themselves in the warm, swirling water, John admiring Irene's beauty, and Irene, uncharacteristically unashamed, returning the compliment. "You're not so bad either, Johnny," she said with a smile as they settled into the spa. They sat side by side, enjoying the warm jets of water. Despite the whiskey fogging his mind, John knew he had to be careful not to jeopardize their friendship. Irene, however, was less hesitant. "Should I make a move? Will he get angry? Oh, hell, why not?" she thought, and moved closer to John. John tensed at her approach, but quickly pulled back, splashing water on his face. "Damn, I'm sorry, Renee, I just can't. I'm sorry," he muttered, trembling slightly. Irene helped the now despondent John out of the spa and into a robe, then guided him to bed like a child. He fell asleep almost immediately. Knowing she couldn't drive home, Irene settled into the second bedroom but struggled to sleep. She realized that John, despite being separated from Esther, was still unavailable. In her heart, she knew she didn't truly love him as more than a friend. Her tears were for John's pain, knowing how deeply he loved Esther and how her betrayal would haunt him. Irene knew John was suffering, but she didn't know how to help. Meanwhile, Esther was also struggling. She had lost weight, looked pale, and was drained. Irene decided to visit Esther, sensing her need for support. "Renee, I messed up badly, but John is wrong. I never had an affair with Jim or anyone else. I can't get him to talk to me. He thinks I've been unfaithful for months, but I haven't. What he saw that night was the first time anything like that happened," Esther explained tearfully. "I understand, Esther, but John is adamant. He won't see or talk to you. I've never seen him like this," Irene replied. "I've hurt him so badly," Esther whispered. "I think he's too hurt even to face me, and I don't blame him." Trying to regain her composure, Esther asked, "Renee, can you stay with me for a while? I need your support." "Of course I'll stay," Irene agreed. though she wished she could do more. Esther looked at her watch and made a call. "Woody, it's Esther. I've decided to give John what he wants. No conditions. Yes, I'll see you tomorrow." Turning to Irene, she said, "I'm going to give John the divorce. He deserves closure, and I can't keep fighting this." Irene paled. "Esther, are you sure? I know you both love each other. Maybe I can talk to John again." "No, it's not fair to keep him in limbo. He's made it clear our marriage is over, and I have no one to blame but myself," Esther said, her voice wavering. "But please stay with me. I really need you right now." "Of course, I'll stay as long as you need," Irene reassured her, taking her cold hands. Later, John was stunned when his attorney, Woody, informed him that Esther wasn't going to fight the divorce. "She's not fighting it? She never gives in easily. What's going on?" "Let her come and see if she goes through with it. I won't hold my breath, though," John replied. After agreeing to meet Woody for dinner, John wandered through his home, feeling conflicted. He should have felt satisfied, but instead he felt uneasy. "What the hell is wrong with me?" he muttered. "I'm getting what I wanted, right? So why this feeling?" As he reached for a beer in the kitchen, the phone rang. "Hello? Oh, hi, Renee. What's up? Forget it. Oh, sure. I'm meeting Woody Holmes tonight, but you're welcome to join us. I'll pick you up around 6:30. And Renee, no more nagging, okay? See you this evening. Bye." Later that evening, John and Irene entered the restaurant where Woody Holmes was waiting. Distracted by thoughts of Esther and the divorce, John introduced his friends rather mechanically. It wasn't until he noticed the silence that he saw Irene blushing and Woody holding her hand as if he never wanted to let go. Hey, you two," John teased. "You're like teenagers on a blind date. I take it you like each other." Woody blushed and released Irene's hand. Sorry about that," he stammered. Irene, still blushing, laughed nervously and quickly took a seat. "Geez, John, you're embarrassing us." Throughout dinner, they avoided discussing John's pending divorce, agreeing to wait until Esther actually signed the papers before speculating. The evening's focus shifted to Woody and Irene, leaving John as the third wheel. He didn't mind and watched with a bemused smile as his friends grew more smitten with each other. John realized this meeting might be good for both of them. Woody might find solace after his wife's passing, and Irene might have finally found a decent man. After dinner, John excused himself to the restroom. When he returned, Woody stammered, John, I hope this is okay." "Oh, for pity's sake," Irene interrupted. "John, Woody would like to drive me home. I'm sure you won't mind." John teased. "Well, I don't know. I did pick you up." "John," Irene warned. John laughed. "Of course not. I don't mind at all." The next day, Esther arrived at Woody's office. "It's nice to see you, even under these circumstances," Woody said, shaking her hand. "Please, have a seat." "Thanks, Woody. Let's get this over with. I understand why John refuses to see or speak with me," Esther said wearily. Woody noticed how pale and tired she looked. "I'm sorry, Esther. I tried to change his mind, but you know how stubborn he is. I'm glad you're not contesting the divorce, though." Esther nodded and signed the papers without reading them, surprising Woody. Aren't you going to read it?" "What for? I trust you, and I know John won't screw me over. He has more integrity than I do," she replied softly. "Esther, this must be tearing you apart. Now that you've signed, I'll try to talk to John again. He might be more open now," Woody suggested. Esther shrugged. "Whatever happens, I'll understand. I ruined my marriage, and I don't blame anyone but myself. I hope John and I could at least be friends, but..." Tears welled up, and she quickly excused herself. After she left, Woody called Irene. "Renee, Esther just left. She signed the divorce papers without even reading them. Can you talk to John and let him know? Maybe we can make him feel a bit guilty about refusing to talk to her. Yes, we're meddling, but for a good cause. Let's meet tonight at 7. John stood outside the home he once shared with Esther, feeling anxious and sweating despite the chilly weather. He hesitated, wondering if meeting her was the right decision. Irene's last conversation with him still bothered him. She insisted that Esther wasn't making excuses, but that the situation was a mix of booze, success, and flattery from Jim. "Nonsense, Irene," John had snapped. "You're saying it was just because she was near him?" "That's not what I meant," Irene shot back. Eventually, she convinced John to meet Esther. As John debated leaving, Esther opened the door, silhouetted by the light behind her. "John, please come in," she pleaded. John straightened, forcing a smile. "Okay, thank you, Esther," he muttered, stepping inside the house that once was his home. Everything seemed unchanged, except for a light layer of dust, which surprised him, knowing how meticulous Esther usually was. He didn't comment. John, thank you for agreeing to see me, Esther said softly. I appreciate it, and I promise I won't keep you long. Okay, Esther. Woody and Irene convinced me to come. I don't see how this will help, but since you're not contesting the divorce, I agreed to meet, John replied flatly, with no warmth in his voice. Esther swallowed, knowing this confrontation would be difficult, but she was determined to face it. She needed to tell John the truth and admit her foolishness, hoping for his forgiveness, which she felt would cleanse her conscience. John, please, just listen. I need you to hear me, Esther pleaded, her eyes full of desperation. John paused, his gaze intense, before nodding and sitting stiffly. Okay, Esther, I'm listening, he said. Esther took a deep breath. John, please believe me when I say I never slept with Jim or anyone else. I never intended to. I know what you saw that night seems to contradict this, but it's the truth. John interrupted. Esther, the truth is rarely pure and never simple. Blushing, Esther pressed on. I can't fully explain my behavior that night. I've tormented myself, asking why I let it happen. The only reasons I can think of are the relief of finishing the contract and the booze I drank. But those are no excuses. I was someone I'm ashamed of, she said, tears streaming down her cheeks. John sat expressionless, his emotions churning. Strangely, he believed her claim of not sleeping with Jim, but that only added to his inner turmoil. I was also angry with you, John, Esther admitted. I felt you weren't being supportive, but I know that's no excuse. I've replayed everything in my mind, and I realize how shallow and stupid I was. But believe me, John, you can't hate me more than I hate myself, she whispered, wiping her tears. Is there any way we can save our marriage? Counseling, anything? John sighed, feeling a deep sense of loss. Esther, if I hadn't interrupted that night, can you honestly say you wouldn't have ended up in bed with him? Wouldn't have been unfaithful? Esther gasped, realizing she couldn't truthfully deny it. She knew she would have crossed that line, and the weight of that truth made her feel sick. You see, Esther, that's the issue, John said, his voice rising before he forced himself to calm down. You cheated on our marriage when you let him kiss you. When you returned those kisses, and when you let him undress and touch you, things meant only for me, your husband. Do you understand? Esther now fully grasped what John was saying. She hadn't considered the full implications of that night until now, and she knew he was right. She would have ended up in Jim's bed, and that realization brought a wave of hopelessness and tears. John looked at her with pity. I feel sorry for you, Essie, and for myself. Maybe I share some blame. I could have been more supportive. But that doesn't excuse your behavior. He continued softly. Now, I have to ask myself a question. Can I live with suspicion or regret? Can I continue our marriage with the constant fear you'll betray me again? Or is it better to live with the regret of our failed marriage? I'm sorry, Essie. I can't live with suspicion. Regret is easier. John stood, watching his wife sobbing on the sofa, and then slowly walked out into the night.